hour at 700 feet altitude there. Question. Can you produce any evidence that a Boeing 767 equipped with regular engines can fly for almost 2 minutes beyond 500 miles per hour in the lower strata of the atmosphere without suffering any visible structural damage? Can you explain how amateur pilots who had never flown a jet before in their life could maintain full control of an airliner that has exceeded the VMO by almost 200 miles per hour? And why would some terrorists who have been lucky enough to get within reach of their target want to risk the entire operation by imposing such a stress on the airplane that it would almost certainly cause them to crash before they complete their mission? One question becomes inevitable at this point. If those were military drones and not regular airliners, what happened to the passengers? With certainty, no one can answer this question. One thing we do know, however, the CIA has been developing plans for covert operations that involve the in-flight swapping of commercial airliners with military drones since the 1960s. One such plan was called Operation Northwoods, and it detailed how to replace a civil airliner with a military drone in midair, unbeknownst to the air traffic controllers. After the swap, the airliner would be landed in a military base. The drone would continue to fly, appearing on radar as the original plane, and would be remotely guided all the way into the target. We don't know whether this is the actual end the passengers met, but one thing we can say for sure, those who called their relatives from their cell phones could not have placed those calls from the airplanes in flight. Minutes after the fourth plane had crashed in Pennsylvania, news was already circulating that several passengers had made calls with their cell phones from the hijacked airplanes.
We are being hijacked. We are being hijacked. Those frightening words were uttered by a passenger aboard United Flight 93 who was able to call emergency personnel on his cell phone before the plane crashed in western Pennsylvania.
And tonight we're getting reports of cell phone calls from at least 3 of those 4 flights. On the second flight that came out of Boston, that was the second flight of the day, and also went into one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, there was a businessman who got off 2 cell phone calls to his father. To CNN commentator Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. She reportedly called her husband twice on a mobile phone to tell him her plane was being hijacked.
The problem is that in 2001, it was practically impossible to make a call with a cell phone from an airplane at cruising altitudes. The whole idea behind cellular phones is that they use low power transmitters, both to keep the cost of the units down and to preserve battery life. It is up to the receiving towers on the ground to pick up and boost their signal before they route it through the system. It is commonly thought that beyond 10,000 feet in altitude, most cell phones become useless. Passenger planes normally cruise at 30,000 feet and beyond. The editors of Popular Mechanics, however, maintain that cell phones do work from cruising airplanes, even at maximum altitudes.
David Dunbar.
With regard to the cell phones, we did what any reporter would do. We talked to experts in the field, and in fact, cell phones do work at that altitude, up to 35,000 feet and higher. And
in 2001?
In 2001, and it might be instructive for you to talk to some of the cell phone experts.
Instead of talking to experts, Japanese television decided to take matters into their own hands. In 2003, they conducted an on-camera experiment near Ontario, Canada, to verify the actual reach of cell phones from different altitudes.
The cellular phone system used in the experiment in Canada is the one used in the United States. 3 cell phones, each from different telephone companies, were used. The experiment begins at 1,000 feet.
Hello?
The results were the same with the other 2. Next, we went up to 4,000 feet. Then, Company B's phone stopped working at 4,000 feet. And when the aircraft rose to 6,000 feet, Company A's phone also became useless. At 8,000 feet, none of the 3 cell phones worked anymore.
No service on A, no service on B, no service on C.
In other words, at an altitude of 35,000 feet, cell phones would have been totally useless.
There is another problem besides altitude that makes calling from a cell phone unthinkable from a cruising airplane, and that is speed. Calling from an aircraft with a cell phone would be like calling from a car traveling at 500 miles per hour. The connection would continuously need to be transferred from one receiving station to the next, and then to the next, and again to the next. The transfer procedure between two receiving stations is called handoff, and it relies on continuous triangulations between the receiving towers in order to establish the exact position of the caller. As the mobile unit approaches the handoff zone, the first tower senses the weakening of the signal and prepares to transfer the call to the second. When a second tower senses the signal is strong enough to take over, the handoff procedure is initiated. If everything goes well, the call is rerouted into the system by the new receiving station. But the speed by which an airplane approaches and crosses over the handoff zone is so high that the towers wouldn't have the time to complete the handoff procedure. The call would be dropped, and the person would need to dial the number from scratch. If one considers the altitude and the speed problems combined, it should be clear that the chances of having an actual conversation with a cell phone from a cruising airplane are practically nil. Even after 2001, both altitude and speed
They got the zombies on there.
The Washington Post wrote, most cell phones can't reach a station from beyond 10,000 feet. Another technical hurdle is to find a way that cell phone calls would be handed off from one cell tower to another on the ground when an aircraft is traveling at 500 miles an hour. And even 10 years after 9/11, people who try to use their cell phone from cruising altitudes are bound to get the same results. Once it became clear that the passengers could not have placed their calls from the cell phones on the airplanes, the official narrative on this issue became more and more ambiguous and non-committal. Theodore Olson, who had initially told the press he had received 2 cell phone calls from his wife Barbara, changed his story to calls made from an airphone. And by the time the 9/11 Commission published their final report, only one mention on the cell phone calls remained. Shortly thereafter, wrote the commission, passengers and flight crew began a series of calls from GTA airphones and cellular phones. No indication on which calls were made from cell phones and which ones with airphones was given. The authorities from the Moussaoui trial also avoided being too specific on the origin of the calls. Within the official documentation, they released this flash animation, which contains all the basic information on the 4 hijacked airplanes. By clicking on any of the flights, one can view the passengers list. By clicking on the telephone icon at the bottom, the passengers who have made phone calls are highlighted. And by clicking on any of the passengers' names, the list of the calls they have made is displayed. Each of the calls lists the exact time it was placed, the duration, the initial part of the number dialed, and the name of the person receiving the call. But the number from which the phone call was placed is missing. The only information available is the location on the plane the calls were presumably made from, row 30 in this case. It's as if the authorities were trying to suggest that the calls were made from airphones without having to put it down on paper. Only in 2 cases did the authorities openly state that a cell phone was used. One is the call allegedly placed to 911 by a passenger who had locked himself in a laboratory where airphones are not available. The second is a call placed by flight attendant C.C. Lyles to her husband, who later described his surprise in receiving a call from her cell phone in a television interview.
Once the phone got disconnected, then I sat up in the bed like, it was like I just woke up. I'm like, was that a real call? So I looked at the caller ID and noticed that it was a call and it was from her cell phone. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. How could you call me from on the plane from a cell phone? Because cell phones don't work on the plane. That's what I'm thinking.
As only these 2 phone calls were admitted by the authorities, the debunkers have universally adopted the only 2 cell phone calls made position.
Le telefonate non sono state fatte con il cellulare, sono state fatte con gli airphone. In soli 2 casi è stato usato un cellulare, quindi quelle 2 telefonate brevissime, frammentarie, sono state fatte quando l'aereo era ancora perfettamente compatibile con la rete cellulare americana.
But one thing is the number of cell phone calls admitted to. Another is the number of calls that were actually made. In the days following 9/11, the FBI interviewed the various people who had received a phone call from their relatives on the planes, and their reports tell a different story. One of the reports reads, starting at approximately 6:30 Pacific Standard Time, which is 9:30 New York time, Dina Burnett received a series from 3 to 5 cellular phone calls from her husband, Thomas Burnett. Burnett was able to determine her husband was using his own cellular phone because the caller ID showed his number. Only one of the calls did not show the caller ID as she was on the line for another call. According to the official documentation, Thomas Burnett made a total of 3 calls, one at 9:30, one at 9:37, and one at 9:44. This means that at least 2 of these calls, if not all 3, were made from Burnett's cellular phone. At 9:30, the plane was flying at 32,000 feet and climbing. At 9:37, it had reached 36,000 feet and was still climbing. At 9:44, it had descended to 22,000 feet, while it accelerated until reaching a ground speed of almost 400 miles per hour. None of these calls seems to have been possible with a cell phone from that airplane. According to another report, United 93 passenger Jeremy Glick saw hijackers on the plane, used a cell phone, and called Makeley, his stepmother, to report the hijacking. He then asked to talk to his wife, Lisbeth.
And he was on the phone and he had told me that his plane had been hijacked.
According to the FBI, Glick's wife, Lisbeth, could not hear any unusual sounds in the background of the call, and the connection was extremely clear, as if he was calling from the next room. Cell phone communication was lost at 9:55. Glick placed the call at 9:37, which means the communication lasted uninterrupted for 18 minutes while the plane was flying between 39,000 and 10,000 feet at an average speed of almost 400 miles per hour. Only a miracle could have kept that connection open for all that time had the call truly been placed from the airplane in flight. Lauren Grancolas possessed a cellular phone and is believed to have allowed another passenger, Honor Wainio, to use the cellular phone. Wainio placed one call to her parents at 9:53, when the plane was at about 10,000 feet, traveling close to 400 miles per hour. Elsa Strong received a cell phone call from her sister, Lisa Gronlund, a passenger on United 93. Gronlund made the call to her sister at 9:46, when the plane was at 17,000 feet and traveling at almost 400 miles per hour. Marion Britton was also a passenger on United 93. Britton's live-in boyfriend received a cellular phone call from Britton during the hijacking. Britton told Fiumano, her boyfriend, that she had borrowed a cell phone from another passenger. Britton's call to Fiumano took place at 9:49, when United 93 was flying beyond 13,000 feet at a speed of 420 miles per hour. Peter Hansen, a passenger on United 175, contacted his mother on cell phone and said the flight had been hijacked. Peter's father, Lee, said that he resisted the temptation to call his son back because he didn't want to place him in more danger by having his cell phone ring on the plane. Peter Hansen called his parents twice, at 8:52 and at 9 a.m. At 8:52, the plane was at 30,000 feet and it was climbing. At 9 o'clock, it was flying at over 18,000 feet in altitude, while it accelerated towards the record-breaking speed of almost 600 miles per hour near sea level. Brian Sweeney was also a passenger on United 175. After learning of the attacks, wrote the FBI, his wife Julie Sweeney returned home to find that her husband had left a message made from his cell phone aboard the plane on their answering machine. Sweeney made the call at 8:58 in between the 2 Hansen calls when the plane was still at 25,000 feet in altitude. While any one of these phone calls could have momentarily been connected by a set of fortunate coincidences, it should be obvious that all these cell phone calls as a whole could not have been made from the cruising airplanes. Question: given the known limitations of the cellular phone system in 2001, can you provide any evidence that the cell phone calls made by the passengers reported by the FBI could have been made from the altitudes, at the speeds, and for the durations indicated for each of them? We do know, however, that the calls were made, as no one has ever doubted that the relatives actually received them. This opens the way to a disturbing possibility, which seems to support the in-flight swap hypothesis, that the passengers were forced to call their relatives under duress, pretending to be on the airplane, while in fact they had already been landed in some unknown location. In support of this hypothesis, we have different elements. One is the conversation passenger Todd Beamer had with a GTA airphone operator, Lisa Jefferson, during the hijack of Flight 93. It is through Lisa Jefferson that the whole world learned about the famous call to action, "Let's roll."
When he told the guys, "Are you ready?" I assumed that they were waiting on his cue. Then they responded to him and he said, "Okay, let's roll."
The 9/11 Commission has established that the hijack took place at 9:28. Todd Beamer was connected to Lisa Jefferson at 9:43, some 15 minutes into the hijacking. The FBI report confirms that Jefferson received the call from Beamer at approximately 8:45 Central Time, which is 9:45 Eastern. But the contents of the conversation are strikingly at odds with the official narrative. According to Jefferson, Beamer called to state that the plane was about to be hijacked. He stated that three individuals, two wielding knives, the third with a bomb strapped to his waist with a red belt, were preparing to take control of the flight. Jefferson estimated that she spoke to Beamer for 7 minutes before the two hijackers armed with knives entered the cockpit. This places the hijacking at around 9:52, while officially it took place at 9:28. This is no small discrepancy. How could Beamer be describing events that are supposed to be happening in front of his eyes when in fact they'd already happened half an hour before? How could the terrorists be preparing to take control of the flight at 9:45 when they had already been in the cockpit for more than 15 minutes? The FBI also wrote that Jefferson noted that the call had an unusually low amount of background noise, the same thing Liz Glick had noticed. Furthermore, the records show that Beamer's call lasted roughly 1 hour and that the line was left open after the crash. We didn't lose a connection, stated Jefferson, because there's a different sound that you use. I never lost connection. It just went silent. Jefferson stayed on the phone, stated the FBI, until she learned Flight 93 had crashed. Question. Since airphones are powered by the same airplane's electrical system, how could the line have remained open for another 45 minutes after the plane had literally disintegrated to the ground in 1,000 pieces? All these discrepancies seem to suggest that Beamer was not on the plane, observing real events unfolding, but was describing an imaginary, pre-scripted situation from a different location. In support of this hypothesis, we also have the dramatic message left by flight attendant Cece Lyles in her husband's answering machine before briefly talking to him on her cell phone. As she herself is suggesting, we should listen very carefully.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m. Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children.
We too can notice the absence of the typical background noise heard inside a plane.
I don't know what to say. There's three guys. They've hijacked the plane. I'm trying to be calm.
After saying goodbye, she seems to fumble with the headset while she whispers a few more words into the mouthpiece.
I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye. End of message.
Even by playing the segment several times, it remains difficult to hear anything different from the words, "It's a frame." In any case, the problem with the phone calls does not change. The cell phone calls confirmed by the FBI in their reports cannot have been made from the cruising airplanes. Someone has to explain where they came from. Was never released. All the debunkers have to show for Flight 77 is a small piece of wreckage carrying an American Airlines serial number. But this piece could have been placed by anyone onto the grass after the impact. In fact, unidentified men in suits were seen meddling with the debris right after the impact, in direct violation of the rules of the crime scene. A contractor who was only 100 yards away from the point of impact stated, "It was DPS, the guys in the black coats. They were here right then and there. That's what I don't understand. Where did they come from? Maybe they knew something. I don't know." The debunkers claim that the witnesses' accounts are more than sufficient to identify the airplane. Hundreds of people saw an American Airlines jet fly into that building. But it's presumable that if anyone wanted a different airplane to look like an American Airlines aircraft, they would have at least thought of painting the fuselage with the same colors. The majority of witnesses recall seeing a large airliner, but there are also witnesses who describe a much smaller, executive-like airplane.
I was just casually looking out out of the window, in the corner of my eye, I saw what looked to be maybe a 20-passenger corporate jet, no markings on the side.
From my office, I was able to see a white jet, maybe like a Gulfstream type commuter jet, I guess.
Omar, you say this was a smaller plane, 10 to 15 passengers maybe?
No es muy grande. No es muy grande. It's not like too big. Just. Tú sabes los aviones comerciales. It's like business.
Like a business jet.
It looked like a commuter plane, 2 engines come down from the south, real low, proceed right on and crash right into the Pentagon.
And are you fairly sure that it was what we sometimes describe and recognize as a small commuter plane?
Yes, it was.
By the witnesses' accounts alone, it's impossible to establish what kind of airplane it was. As the plane clipped 5 light poles before striking the Pentagon, the debunkers maintained that the distance between the light poles indicates a corridor wide enough that only a large airliner could have created it.
Ce qu'on peut voir justement, c'est que l'avion à l'arrivant a tombé 5 pylônes qui étaient sur sa trajectoire, et ces pylônes étaient espacés de 25 mètres.
Torniamo, alcuni lampioni abbattuti, 5 lampioni, tutti insieme fanno una fascia larga 26 metri. Facciamo finta di ipotizzare che non sappiamo che si tratta di un aereo. Sappiamo che c'è qualche cosa largo 26 metri che è passato di lì.
26 meters is roughly 85 feet, but the wingspan of a 757 is 124 feet, which means any airplane with an 85-foot wingspan could have downed those light poles. It didn't need to be a 757. In fact, with a 100-ton airliner hitting a reinforced concrete building like the Pentagon, one would expect to find a situation similar to this. What immediately stood out instead was the absence of large, identifiable pieces of debris, which are usually found after the crash of an airliner. Bob Pugh was the first professional cinematographer to arrive on site.
No one was in control of the area. I had free reign. And there's a lot of debris in the foreground of those videos. Again, it's very small pieces. I mean, I'm standing on pieces a dinner plate or smaller in size. And all the while, I'm looking for wreckage. And I can't find a piece of anything that I recognize. I can't see the tail. I can't see the wheels. I can't see the engines. There's no chairs. There's no luggage.
According to the debunkers, there are no large pieces of debris on the lawn because most of the airplane ended up inside the building.
Quindi gran parte dei frammenti dell'aereo non sono fuori perché l'aereo è entrato nell'edificio.
Purdue University has produced a detailed computer animation illustrating the official version of the event.
We had the plans for the Pentagon, all the details, right down to the last reinforcing bar. The speed of the airplane and the direction from which came was given to us by the Transport Safety Institute.
According to the official version, the plane approached in a low trajectory, clipping 5 light poles from the nearby intersection. Slightly tilted to the left, it hit a trailer parked outside the building with the bottom of the right wing, and then impacted the facade at an angle of 42 degrees. Most of the plane penetrated the facade and proceeded inside the building on a diagonal course, causing destruction as it was being destroyed. The fuselage pierced through the outer wall of the C-ring, producing this round-shaped exit hole 10 to 12 feet wide. There are, however, many problems with this version of the events. The first one is the actual wingspan of a Boeing 757. Most of us remember the facade of the Pentagon after it had collapsed. But before it collapsed, right after the impact, this is what the building looked like. This series of pictures was taken by a Navy photographer shortly after the impact. There doesn't seem to be enough damage for a Boeing 757 to have penetrated the building almost in full. Using the best part from each image, a digital expert has created this composite picture, which has become the universal tool of reference for anyone involved in the debate. The composite picture shows an almost continuous opening at ground level, about 90 feet wide. The damage extends to the second floor, with an entry hole about 15 feet wide. This is enough, maintain the debunkers, to have accommodated most of the plane inside the building.
Effectivement, on peut se demander où est-il passé. Et puis, si on prend des photos qui ont été prises à des instants différents, qui justement, par un assemblage, ont permis de montrer les dégâts qui étaient réellement visibles sur la façade, et là, on voit clairement que tout le rez-de-chaussée a été anéanti sur une longueur de 30 mètres. Et puis, au milieu, bien sûr, vous avez le trou de la carlingue.
That gash in the E-ring was about 90 feet across. The wingspan of the plane was about 124 and change. That punched the hole into the building.
It is true. The wingspan of a 757 is 124 feet, but the debunkers forget that the plane came in at a 42-degree angle, which makes the projected wingspan of the facade 160 feet wide. That's almost twice the 90-foot existing gash. As shown in this animation, the left wing should have also destroyed these 2 windows left of the opening. But the whole segment to the left of the opening doesn't seem to have been hit by a wing traveling at 500 miles per hour. The window's wooden frames are still in place, and the glass seems to have been broken from the ensuing explosion, not from the impact itself. The limestone covering the facade has fallen off, but the bricks underneath appear practically untouched. By the same projected angle, the right wing should have impacted the facade all the way to this column on the second floor. In fact, there is a diagonal cut on the second floor wall that could have resulted from the wing's impact. But this puts most of the wing above the second floor slab, which means it never penetrated the facade to begin with. So where did it go? This is the explanation by Popular Mechanics for what happened to the wings.
The wings did not fully penetrate the facade. In fact, the wings had already been partially sheared off by the time the plane hit the building.
The fuselage mainly made the hole that existed. Conspiracy theorists want to know why it wasn't the width of the full wingspan of the plane. And actually just the simple reason was that the wings came off.
But where did they go? Popular Mechanics doesn't say. A similar problem is posed by the horizontal stabilizers, which extend some 50 feet in width. As they are mounted 3 feet higher than the wings, they should have impacted the facade approximately here and here. But there are no visible marks from their impact on the facade, nor is any recognizable piece of the stabilizers visible on the lawn. Same story for the tail, which raises 24 feet above the fuselage. At the time of impact, the tail should have hit as high as the windows on the 4th floor. The Purdue animation shows the tail entering the building in full, as if it were cutting through butter. But the facade above the entry hole doesn't show any significant damage, and the glass from the windows around the hole isn't even broken. For the missing tail and stabilizers, Popular Mechanics offers this generic explanation.
A plane flying 500 miles an hour, hitting a concrete wall that is extremely reinforced. There's not really much left of it. You're not going to see it sitting on the lawn of the Pentagon in 1 or 2 or 3 pieces.
But here's the problem. If part of the wings, the stabilizers, and the tail disintegrated in 1,000 pieces against the facade, how could the fuselage penetrate it almost entirely? The fuselage is by far the weakest part of the plane, as it basically consists of an empty cylinder meant to carry the passengers and their belongings. How fragile the fuselage is compared to the wings is explained by aviation expert Jacques Roland.
Jacques Roland, ancien général de l'armée de l'air, est aujourd'hui le meilleur expert en crash aérien auprès des tribunaux.
Il n'est pas du tout évident de comprendre qu'effectivement, dès que vous avez un choc à l'avant, l'ensemble s'enfonce à la vitesse de pénétration, en fait. Et le premier point dur se trouve ici. Tant que vous n'arrivez pas là, l'avion, c'est du papier.
Question. How could the fuselage, which is the weakest part of the plane, penetrate the facade almost entirely, while part of the wings, the stabilizers, and the tail, which are relatively stronger, were unable to do so and were shattered in 1,000 pieces instead? Even more mysterious is the disappearance of the engines. The 757 that allegedly hit the Pentagon was equipped with 2 RB-211 engines built by Rolls-Royce. Almost 8 feet in height, weighing over 7,000 pounds each, the internal core of the engine is made with components so sturdy and resistant that they are considered practically indestructible.
It's a rotator at 10,000 revolutions per minute, with blade speed of about 800 miles per hour. The component itself operates at something like 300 degrees above the melting point of the alloy.
To operate at around 1,700 degrees, they're designed not to melt.
Quali sono le parti che non vengono distrutte, che non si squagliano per il calore?
I pezzi del carrello e il cuore dei 2 motori, che è molto più compatto della parte esterna dei motori, ovviamente fatte in materiali che devono resistere alla temperatura, 2000-2500 gradi, per cui la parte centrale dei 2 motori è sicuramente sopravvissuta all'impatto.
But where are they? In their animation, Purdue University has chosen to ignore the issue. As one can see, moments before the impact, the 2 engines simply vanish into thin air. Debunker Paolo Attivissimo has made what he calls a cautious suggestion.
Questo motore, quello SR211, questo è un oggetto trovato davanti al Pentagon. Come dicevo prima, probabilmente i motori non sono completamente entrati. Questo oggetto è di forma compatibile. Faccio il prudente, dico semplicemente che è di forma compatibile.
But this rotor could have come from any engine. There is also another picture of a similar disc, possibly the same disc, from a different angle. And then there is this part of an engine found inside the Pentagon. But we are not looking for scraps. We are looking for 2 3-ton pieces of machinery made with steel and titanium that after an accident should look something like this, or like this, or like this. In fact, had the Pentagon been hit by a 757, the 2 engines would have impacted the facade around these 2 points, just below the wings. This means they would have proceeded inside the building on a path somewhat parallel to the fuselage, carving a trail of destruction much more devastating than any other part of the plane.
È un proiettile simile al motore?
Sì, sì, sicuramente sì.
Può essere tranquillamente un proiettile. Lanciato a 800 km/h la struttura viaggia e non si ferma al minimo stadio.
But there are no engines visible outside the exit hole, nor are there any other holes in the wall that could have been caused by an engine. Question: can you explain what happened to the core of the 2 engines, which is built with components so strong and resistant to be considered practically indestructible? Now for the biggest mystery of all, the exit hole. According to the official version, it was the fuselage of the plane that created this hole in the wall of the C-ring. On September 15, 2001, the Pentagon renovation manager stated, the plane penetrated through the E-ring, D-ring, C-ring. The nose of the plane just barely broke through the inside of the C-ring, so it was extending into AE drive a little bit. The AE drive is the internal alley separating the C-ring from the B-ring. But how could the fuselage have made it all the way through the wall of the C-ring?
Un aereo che pesa 120 tonnellate, lanciato a 800 km, impatta una facciata, la trapassa. Nel trapassare viene tritato dalle colonne che ci sono in mezzo, a mo' di grattugia, se volete passare questo termine, e alla fine quel che rimane sono solo frammenti molto piccoli. Quel poco che rimane in fondo arriva dall'altra parte.
If the fuselage is only a cylinder and it gets cut and ground by the columns in 1,000 pieces, how can it retain the circular shape needed to punch this almost perfectly round hole in the wall? This is where the explanations by the debunkers become absolutely fascinating.
The mass of this plane penetrated the building with enormous energy and continued into the building in a state almost more like a liquid than a solid.
Then encountered reinforced concrete columns 2 feet thick. So the aircraft was flying through a forest of columns.
The plane became almost like an artillery shell or tank round, but actually came out, it was a circular ball of fire, which is how fire goes in a movie. That's why it has a perfectly round shape.
By this time, there was an avalanche of debris that was moving as a single mass, much as in an avalanche of snow.
Whether it was a liquid mass, a ball of fire, or an avalanche of snow, all these hypotheses are flatly contradicted by the Pentagon Building Performance Report, a document published in 2003 by the American Society of Civil Engineers. In assessing the condition of the columns on the first floor, the report reads, columns 3G, 3H, 3J, and 5J were damaged but still standing, although in the direct path of the fuselage. It is highly unlikely that any significant portion of the fuselage could have retained structural integrity at this point in its travel. The aircraft frame most certainly was destroyed before it had traveled a distance that approximately equaled the length of the aircraft. The length of the aircraft is 155 feet, which is roughly half the distance between the entry and the exit holes. That no substantial part of the fuselage reached the wall of the C-ring was also confirmed by the first eyewitnesses who described the damage inside the Pentagon.
So the plane went in up to the E, D, and to the C-ring, not all the way through the C-ring.
Furthermore, if we follow the lines connecting the exit hole to the impact zone at the angle of 42 degrees, we see that the path is repeatedly blocked at some point or another by columns that are damaged but still standing. This means that no substantial piece of debris could have traveled from the impact zone to the exit hole in any case. Question: given that, according to the Pentagon Building Performance Report, the aircraft frame most certainly was destroyed before it had traveled a distance that approximately equaled the length of the aircraft, and that it is highly unlikely that any significant portion of the fuselage could have retained structural integrity from that point on, can you explain what caused the almost perfectly round exit hole in the outer wall of the C-ring? In conclusion, we have an opening on the first floor that's a bit more than half the projected wingspan of the 757. The tip of the left wing and most of the right wing missing without a valid explanation. The horizontal stabilizers and the tail also missing without a valid explanation. A fuselage that behaved more like a warhead than an empty cylinder made with aluminum. no trace whatsoever of the core of the two engines, and an exit hole on the C-ring that no one can rationally explain. Given all these facts, we must conclude that the damage observed at the Pentagon is not compatible with and must have been created by something other than a Boeing 757. The mystery of what hit the Pentagon could have been easily solved if the FBI had released the videos from dozens of surveillance cameras that are placed all around the impact zone.
Yeah, there were a lot of cameras around the Pentagon. If you look at the Pentagon, you can see that there's cameras on each corner. There's cameras at some of the businesses around the Pentagon. And we know in those cases, the tapes were confiscated immediately by the FBI within hours of the event.
When a Freedom of Information Act requesting all the videos covering the impact zone was filed, the FBI agent in charge of the tapes responded, "The FBI possessed 85 videotapes that might be potentially responsive to plaintiff's FOIA request. But," concluded the agent, "I determined that only one videotape showed the impact of Flight 77 into the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. This is the tape we have all seen many, many times." The FBI could have released all the videos anyway, just to allow the public to see by themselves what was actually shown in each of them. But for some reason, they preferred to keep them under wraps. Not only has this question never been answered, but an in-depth analysis of the only footage of the impact ever released contains a dramatic surprise. Initially, the DoD released these 5 frames taken from a Pentagon parking security camera. Later on, in 2006, the DoD released the entire sequence from which the 5 frames had been extracted. The time-lapse sequence runs at approximately 1 frame per second, and it shows the moments leading up to the impact, the large explosion, and the billowing fire that ensued. Unfortunately, the video does not show the airplane in transit. All we can see in the frame preceding the explosion is what appears to be the tail of an airplane followed by a trail of white smoke. But the body of the plane remains covered by this concrete column standing in the foreground. The Department of Defense also released a second video taken by a different camera from the same parking lot. The second camera was actually located in the very column that obscured the view of the plane in the first video. This aerial shot of the Pentagon shows the actual location of the 2 cameras. The second camera faces in the same direction as the first, and it offers a clear, unobstructed view of the same field of action. By using the moment of the explosion, we can synchronize the 2 cameras with absolute frame-by-frame accuracy. By synchronizing the 2 cameras, we notice that the second video begins earlier than the first, while the first lasts longer than the second. This leaves us with a middle comment section of about 100 frames, which are perfectly synchronized with each other. From the moment the police car moves on, the action proceeds in an identical manner, both in the frames preceding the explosion and in those following the explosion. Especially in the second part of the videos, after the explosion, we can verify how each couple of frames depicts exactly the same action by looking at the shape of the billowing smoke. This confirms that the 2 cameras were operating in perfect synchronization. This is only to be expected. After all, the 2 cameras were controlled by a centralized recording system called multiplexer, or TLR. There is, however, one pair of frames from the 2 videos that shows a completely different action from one another. They happen to be the 2 frames in which the plane travels across the lawn. It's frame 23 in the relative count. As the first video showed the tail and the trail of smoke, we would expect the second camera placed in this concrete column to show the entire body of the plane in the same position. It does not. In the corresponding frame, camera 2 shows only the tip of the plane entering frame from the right-hand corner. But how can the nose of the plane be behind the tail at the same moment in time? The synchronization system allows for a maximum fluctuation between the 2 cameras, or margin of error, of 1/30th of a second. Given that the plane is traveling at 750 feet per second, the maximum possible fluctuation between the 2 cameras would translate into a difference of a mere 25 feet in the position of the plane. A 757 is 155 feet long. Even calculating the perspective due to the diagonal path, this is far from sufficient to explain the large discrepancy between the 2 images. Furthermore, after this moment, the 2 videos resume their perfect synchronization, which is maintained all the way to the end. Why these two crucial frames, and only these two, are so different from one another has puzzled researchers and digital experts alike. The same digital expert who had prepared the universal image from the Pentagon has also conducted an in-depth technical analysis of the two videos released by the Department of Defense. After confirming that the two cameras were synchronized by the same multiplexer system, this expert has compiled a table comparing the contents of each pair of frames. As one can see, frame 23 is the only one showing a strong inconsistency between the two images. The expert has then proceeded to analyze the two frames with the most sophisticated digital tools and has obtained some astonishing results. A series of Boolean subtractions reveals that a small part of the image is actually present in both frames. What is said to be the nose of the airplane in camera 2 is also present as part of the smoke trail in camera 1. It seems in fact as if someone has retouched this area of the frame by means of cut and paste in order to cover the plane, while he has kept the end of the smoke trail to make it look like the nose of the plane entering frame. Question: given that the maximum fluctuation between the two cameras would translate in a difference of 25 feet in the position of the plane, can you provide a valid explanation for the large discrepancy between the two corresponding frames? Absent a valid explanation for this discrepancy, we must conclude that at least one of the two frames is the result of intentional manipulation or photoshopping. If we now summarize the situation at the Pentagon, we have the total lack of evidence that the unknown incoming was in fact Flight 77, the mysterious phantom plane that attracted the attention in the opposite direction, the failure from the White House to shoot down the incoming even though it posed a serious and imminent threat, a totally illogical approach maneuver from a terrorist's point of view, an alleged hijacker incapable of performing that maneuver, the absence of any significant part of the plane from the wreckage, the damage to the building clearly incompatible with a 757, a doctored tape of the impact, and the obvious reluctance by the FBI to release any other tape that could allow the identification of the plane. The whole issue of Flight 93 basically boils down to one question. If you just happened to drive by and someone told you that a Boeing 757 has just crashed into this hole and most of the 100-ton airliner is now buried under the ground, would you believe it or not? This is the kind of puzzlement that people from Shanksville experienced when they arrived on the crash site of Flight 93.
We drove back that road, and when the road ended, that's where the plane was. And I mean, the only thing I could tell them, I get out, like I said, I heard this thing, I felt the explosion, saw the fireball, and I get up there and I'm thinking, what is it? Just debris, pieces, small pieces of debris. The trees were singed and gone, just smoldering.
Nothing. It was just little pieces. There was nothing to actually, like a door or window or anything. You couldn't really, it was just little pieces of shrapnel everywhere.
What's that right there? Over in here.
TV reporters were also at a loss when faced with the idea that an actual plane had just crashed on that site.
At first I wasn't even sure that this was, that these were pieces of the plane. They're so small, and it's indistinguishable. You can't tell whether it's a piece of the fuselage or a piece of the seats. You don't know what it is.
Chris Kanicki, he's a photographer. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. From what we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Really, all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris.
Word also went out to Somerset County Coroner Wallace Miller. He hurried to the scene, an abandoned strip mine. When he arrived, he couldn't believe his eyes.
It looked like someone gouged about a 10-foot wide, 10-foot deep trough through the strip mine. But when you looked in, it was just covered with dirt. There was nothing there that you could really say was an airplane.
Dennis Roddy was the editor-in-chief of the Pittsburgh Gazette.
Airplane debris? Nothing I could identify.
Possibly the most disconcerted of all was the mayor of Shanksville, Ernie Stuhl.
Mein Schwager und ein guter Freund von mir waren die ersten. Sie haben in Shanksville an einer Straßenecke gestanden, als sie unterhalten. Ihr Wagen stand gleich in der Nähe, und so waren sie die ersten hier. Dann kam erst die Feuerwehr. Alle waren die vor den Kopf gestoßen, weil sie zu einem Flugzeugabsturz gerufen wurden. Aber da war kein Flugzeug. Nowhere kein Flugzeug. Sie wurden hier zu der Unfallstelle geschickt und da war kein Flugzeug? Nein, da war nichts. Nur dieses Loch. Das ist es, was Sie sagen. Ich dachte immer, das sei die Absturzstelle. Das ist sie. Aber da ist nichts zu sehen.
It's in that hole, says the FBI, that most of the airplane lays literally buried in the ground. Much of the plane and its contents were found beneath the soft dirt, states the FBI's website. Evidence technicians found the flight data recorder about 12 feet below the surface and the cockpit voice recorder about 25 feet deep. Since the two black boxes are located in the tail of the plane, one must conclude that also the cockpit, most of the fuselage, the passengers' seats and bodies, and their belongings somehow managed to get buried deep underground. The only ones who don't seem to have a problem with this explanation are the debunkers.
We have this idea that when planes crash, they crack in half and there's this dramatic burn wreckage. That's what happens when planes crash at very low speeds, usually on approach or takeoff from an airport. This plane was flying straight down. It was approaching the speed of sound. It would have if it had gone much farther. And it penetrated into soft ground with incredible velocity.
Qui la caduta è stata diversa. L'aereo era quasi verticale quando si è schiantato a una velocità altissima. L'aereo si schiaccia quasi nel terreno, produce un cratere piccolo e quello che rimane va a finire quasi tutto nel terreno.
First of all, it isn't true that the plane hit the ground almost vertically. According to the NTSB flight path, the 757 hit the ground at an angle of about 45 degrees. This fact alone removes much of the exceptionality the debunkers would like to attach to this crash. But even if it were true that the plane fell almost vertically, how could the hole have closed itself up even before the first responders arrived? This is not mud. This is your typical hard country soil. When a plane crashes and makes a hole in the ground, the hole remains open and quite visible from above. This, for example, is the crater caused by Flight Pan Am 103 when it crashed in Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. It's true that the 747, the plane that crashed in Lockerbie, is larger than a 757, but it's also true that the Pan Am flight broke up in midair due to an explosion, and that only part of the plane caused the crater seen in the photographs. Let's compare the size of the Lockerbie crater, several blocks wide, with the one in Shanksville, several feet wide. This is the size of a human being next to the Lockerbie crater. This is the size of a human being next to the Shanksville crater. These are people looking down into the Lockerbie crater. These are people standing by the Shanksville crater after the accident. Compare the size of a car with the Lockerbie crater and the size of a small truck with the crater in Shanksville. This is the largest chunk of the Pan Am flight that was found near Lockerbie. It's almost half the front part of the fuselage and includes part of the cockpit. This is the largest piece of debris we have ever seen from Shanksville. It's a piece of fuselage a bit wider than 2 passenger windows in a picture released 5 years after the event. This is an engine from Pan Am Flight 103, which plunged to the ground at a location near Lockerbie. This, we are told, is an engine from Flight 93, which was supposedly excavated in the hole in Shanksville. These are images from different crashes, showing that the tail of the plane almost always survives. It does so because it's normally the last part of the plane impacting the terrain, when most of the kinetic energy has already been dissipated to the ground. This is the mark on the ground that was supposedly left by the tail of Flight 93 before it vanished into thin air. These are the chunks of the wings that are normally found after a plane crash. These are the marks that the wings of the plane allegedly left on the ground in Shanksville before vanishing with everything else into thin air. And this is the center of the hole, which is supposed to have swallowed practically the whole fuselage. But this is where the official story of the crash becomes truly fascinating. According to the FBI, after 2 weeks of excavation in Shanksville, 95% of the plane had been recovered, allegedly left on the ground in Shanksville before vanishing with everything else into thin air. And this is the center of the hole, which is supposed to have swallowed practically the whole fuselage. But this is where the official story of the crash becomes truly fascinating. According to the FBI, after 2 weeks of excavation in Shanksville, 95% of the plane had been recovered. A Boeing 757 weighs roughly 100 tons. A mid-sized car weighs about 2,500 pounds, a ton and a half. This means that, according to the FBI, the equivalent of at least 50 to 60 cars was actually excavated from the ground. Question: can you explain how most of an airplane weighing 100 tons could end up buried deep underground in a hole that closed itself up before the first responders arrived? But even if it were true that 95% of the plane has been recovered, where is it? Why have we never been shown it? When a controversial accident happens, all efforts are made to recover as many pieces of the plane as possible. These, for example, are the remains of the flight from Lockerbie, which have been pieced together in a hangar. These are the remains of TWA 800, the flight that crashed in the ocean near Long Island in July 1996. These are the remains of flight Italia 870, which crashed in unclear circumstances near Ustica, Italy in 1980. Why wasn't the same thing done with United 93? Given the controversy on the absence of debris, coupled with the rumors of a possible shoot-down, it would have been the perfect way to put all the conspiracy theories to rest. Instead, we are told all the recovered parts of the plane have been sequestered by the FBI, and no one has ever been able to see them. As far as we know, Flight 93 might have never crashed in Shanksville to begin with. There is another problem for those who support the official version. When an airplane crashes to the ground, normally a plume of thick black smoke rises to the sky and continues to burn until all the fuel is consumed. But instead of being faced by something like that, this is what the people in Shanksville saw.
Listen to what they saw. Das ist das, was wir gesehen haben. Sieht fast aus wie ein Pilz.
It looked like a mushroom cloud, he said. But under the cloud, there is no plume of black smoke rising to the sky, and the mushroom shape is the classic result of a bomb explosion. The same local reporter also noticed the absence of smell from burnt jet fuel and the odor of scorched earth instead.
And there's a very strong odor of the scorched earth. The only way I can describe it. It doesn't smell like jet fuel. It smells like, Kendall, how do you describe it? Just burned earth. Burned earth. It smells like burned earth.
The grass next to the hole also indicates there was no fire after the explosion, as it appears perfectly dry and untouched all around. Some have suggested that this is only the initial explosion and that the plume of black smoke hasn't started to rise yet. But this hypothesis is disproven by this video, taken by a local amateur shortly after the explosion took place.
Crash over on Lambertsville Road.
As one can see, the initial cloud floats in the air, but the typical plume of black smoke rising from below is not there.
I don't know anything.
If we fast forward the video, we can see that the situation doesn't change much. After more than 1 minute, the initial cloud is still there, but there is no black smoke whatsoever rising from below. Question: since the plane was carrying 8,000 to 10,000 gallons of fuel at the time of impact, can you explain why there is no plume of black smoke rising from the ground after the initial explosion? But the toughest problem for the supporters of the official version is to explain how different parts of debris could end up several miles away from the crash site, even though the plane is supposed to have hit the ground in one piece. William Bunch was a reporter for the Pittsburgh Gazette.
I gathered all the information I could and quickly learned that there were a lot of things about the crash of Flight 93 that didn't really add up right away. The fact that debris fell on this lake a couple miles away at the same time that the plane was crashing.
The lake Bunch is talking about is Indian Lake, which is located a couple of miles southeast of the crash site. According to the debunkers, there is a valid explanation for the debris found in the lake.
Perché quello che dice di effetti trovati chissà dove sono arrivati a Indian Lake, che a 1600 metri di distanza sono stati trovati pezzettini di carta che sono volati perché c'è vento.
First of all, it's not true that there was wind on that day. As the images show, there was only a light breeze gently moving the air all around. The very cloud from the explosion, as we have seen before, practically didn't move for over 1 minute. Secondly, it wasn't just small pieces of paper that were found. From the Pittsburgh Tribune, we read, by Wednesday morning, crash debris began washing ashore at the marina. Witness John Flegel said there was something that looked like a rib bone amid pieces of seats, small chunks of melted plastic, and checks. In any case, the problem is not limited to Indian Lake, which is 2 miles away from the crash site. Debris from the plane was found as far as 8 miles away near New Baltimore. This is the map of the debris field published by the Pittsburgh Tribune. CNN also reported the secondary field, confirming that the debris belonged to Flight 93.
Well, Darren, in the last hour or so, the FBI and the state police here have confirmed that they have cordoned off the second area about 6 to 8 miles away from the crater here where this plane went down. This is apparently another debris site, which raises a number of questions. Why would debris from the plane, and they identified it specifically as being from this plane, why would debris be located 6 miles away? Could it have blown that far away? Seems highly unlikely. And as to whether it broke up on the way, we don't know that. FBI is being very tight-lipped about that. But again, it leads to that possibility. It certainly leads to a number of questions.
Since the plane is supposed to have hit the ground in one piece, can you explain how it was possible for debris to be found 6 to 8 miles from the crash site on a day when only a light breeze was blowing? The extension of the debris field is not the only fact suggesting a shoot down. There are other elements that seem to confirm it.
Standing there watching on TV, and the lights flickered in the building. About that time, we heard the engines roar, and we took off out of the building. As we were coming out from the office out through the building, the ground shook, and we heard, big boom. Looked over and saw the big ball of fire.
Flegel later told other people about the lights flickering.
I was in Atlanta, and I was sitting there talking to another guy, and I was explaining to him about when we were standing in the office and the lights flickered and everything. And as soon as he heard me say that, he immediately stopped me and he said, well, I'm retired from the Air Force. He said, that plane was shot down. And I said, why? And he said, because whenever the lights flickered, they zapped the radar frequency on everything before they shoot.
The mayor of Indian Lake also remembers the power going off just before the crash.
Our power had gone off, and then we felt a tremor. It sounded like a missile came across our house. I mean, they were going that fast.
The mayor of Shanksville, Colonel Short, had something interesting to say. I know of 2 people, I will not mention names, that heard a missile, Stuhl said. They both lived very close, within a couple of 100 yards. This one fellow served in Vietnam, and he says he's heard them, and he heard one that day. But who could have possibly shot the plane down? As far as we know, there are no witnesses who saw fighter jets near Flight 93. There are, however, some witnesses who saw a small, unmarked white plane which flew over the area just before the crash.
I was just driving along here. It was a beautiful day. Had my window open, had the stereo on, and when I got up here almost to the stop sign, this small white plane at the time, that's what I thought went over top of me. It was so smooth. It just glided right over me, just like that. And then I ducked, and when I looked up again, then it just banked to the right and went over and went down behind the trees.
Something caught my eye, and here was a white plane, and it was coming from the crash site area.
The debunkers maintain that there is no mystery behind the white plane. It was a corporate jet, they say, which air traffic controllers had asked to take a look on the ground after they realized they had lost Flight 93.
There was, in fact, a little white jet that was seen in the area after Flight 93 crashed. A number of witnesses saw it. It was a little Dassault Falcon corporate jet that was flying from a nearby airport. And what happened is once air traffic control knew they'd lost Flight 93, they asked the nearest aircraft to go over the area and actually radio back exact coordinates for the crash site.
Now,
Susan McElwain, however, remembers seeing the white plane before the crash, not after.
by 11:30 that night, the FBI came, wanted to talk to me. They kept asking me how big the plane was. I said the plane, it was small, wasn't much bigger than my van that I saw, and that it went over top of me. And I said, we want to make sure maybe it was ours and not somebody else's. And then that's when he did seem to get a little nicer. Told me that it was a white Learjet. Someone was taking pictures. I said, before the crash? And he said, well, we got to go.
John Flegel also saw the mysterious plane. Since Flegel arrived on the spot within a minute from the crash, the corporate jet sent by the air traffic controllers would not have had time to descend over the area yet, while the mystery plane was already getting away from the spot into the blue sky.
We got there, like I said, probably within
White Learjet.
within 45 seconds or a minute of impact. We were there. We were there before any firemen, any paramedics, or anybody. We were on site. When we got there, there was a plane flying up above. And he was smart. He flew straight for the sun. So you couldn't look at it and see exactly what type of plane or if it was a fighter or what it was. But, we caught a glimpse of it. And as he was swinging, he was traveling in the same direction. as the plane.
If the plane was actually shot down, one big question arises. What are we to make of the heroic gesture by the passengers who chose to force the plane to the ground, we are told, in order to save the lives of other fellow countrymen? In truth, this heroic gesture by the passengers has been refuted by the 9/11 Commission itself. It was the hijackers who wrote the commission and